Before there were streets, before the sound of a train whistle echoed across the flatlands, there was only wind. Endless prairies stretched in every direction, swaying under a wide Illinois sky. It looked quiet, empty maybe, but this land wasn't silent. Long before the name Champaign was ever imagined, these plains were home to powerful stories of survival, migration, and change. The first people to know this land weren't settlers or surveyors, they were the indigenous nations of the prairies. The Kickapoo, Peoria, and other tribes from the Illinois Confederation lived across this region long before statehood, relying on the fertile ground for hunting and the rivers for trade. To them, this land wasn't wilderness, it was home, a living ecosystem they understood as deeply as their own heartbeat. But that balance began to break. By the early 1800s, European American settlers pushed westward, driven by the federal government's promise of open land and new beginnings. Treaties were signed, some negotiated, others forced, and by the 1830s, most of the original inhabitants were pushed from the region. The prairies that had sustained indigenous life for centuries were suddenly declared unclaimed, ready for white settlement. And yet, those early pioneers who arrived in central Illinois discovered something unexpected. The land was beautiful, but brutal. The tallgrass prairie, while fertile, was difficult to plow with the tools of the time. Harsh winters, vast floods, and isolation tested anyone who dared to stay. Some historians believe that the earliest settlers around what would become Champaign, families arriving from Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, barely survived those first years. The land gave, but it also demanded everything in return. By 1833, this part of Illinois became part of Champaign County, named after Champaign County, Ohio, where many of the new residents had come from. But there was no city here yet, just small settlements, scattered cabins, and farms connected by dirt tracks. The county seat was in Urbana, a small village forming east of what would later be downtown Champaign. Urbana was supposed to be the heart of the area, but fate, guided by iron and steel, had other plans, because a storm was brewing beneath the calm, the coming of the railroads. It's hard to imagine today, but one decision by a railroad company would split this prairie into two rival towns, one destined to rise, the other to resent. Urbana's founders believed the railroad would pass through their town. They had built with that faith. But when surveyors came, they chose a route 2 miles to the west, through open prairie land that wasn't part of any settlement. The reason? Urbana's terrain and existing plans didn't suit the Illinois Central Railroad's design. The company needed flat ground, space for stations, and land cheap enough to develop from scratch. The railroad executives made a decision that would change everything. They would build their line and a new depot away from Urbana.
And just like that, in 1854, a new settlement began to rise from the prairie dust. They called it West Urbana. It started with a station, a few shacks, and a handful of merchants. But that humble outpost, born out of Urbana's disappointment, would one day grow into something far larger, a city that would define central Illinois. West Urbana was never supposed to survive. It was meant to serve the railroad, not compete with the established county seat. But it did more than survive. It thrived. Within a few years, new businesses crowded around the station. Farmers from miles around came here to sell grain and buy supplies. Hotels appeared, and merchants set up permanent shops. The railroad brought people, and people built opportunity. By 1860, West Urbana had grown so fast that its residents demanded independence. They petitioned the Illinois legislature for their own charter, and won. In 1860, the town of West Urbana officially changed its name to Champaign. But its birth was not peaceful. Urbana saw Champaign's growth as betrayal. Rivalries erupted between the two towns, economic, political, and cultural. Newspapers of the time recorded bitter exchanges between the communities, each claiming to be the rightful heart of the county. The Illinois Central Railroad, caught between them, quietly benefited from both. That rivalry would shape everything that came next. Champaign, though young, had energy. It was a town built by migrants, traders, and risk-takers. Its streets filled with the clamor of wagons, hammers, and locomotives. By the 1870s, it had saloons, churches, schools, and a growing downtown. But beneath that success, tensions simmered. It was still a place fighting for legitimacy, against the weather, against debt, and against its neighbor to the east. And then, a decision by the state of Illinois would ignite the next great transformation, one that would define Champaign forever. Because in the years after the Civil War, Illinois lawmakers began searching for a site to build a new kind of institution, a land-grant university that would bring science and agriculture together. Urbana lobbied hard for it, desperate to reclaim its prestige. But Champaign, just 2 miles away, had what the state needed most: rail access and open land. The result was a compromise that no one expected, and one that bound two rivals together for life. In 1867, the Illinois Industrial University, what we now know as the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, was founded between the two towns. It was built not in Urbana and not in Champaign, but right between them. A new center was born on that prairie border, and both cities would grow toward it, slowly merging into one continuous community. Yet each retained its own identity, its own pride. Still, the creation of the university didn't guarantee success. The first years were rough, students were few, facilities were scarce, and the Civil War had left the state financially drained. Some predicted the school would close within a decade. But it survived thanks to the relentless push of its first leaders and the growing belief that Illinois' future depended on education and innovation. That belief would transform Champaign from a railroad town into something more: a city of intellect, progress, and ambition. But the transformation wasn't smooth. The late 1800s brought fire, corruption, and deep division. The railroads that built the town also brought danger, and the boom of business would lead to moments of near collapse. Yet every time the city stumbled, it rebuilt stronger than before. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how a rough railroad village evolved into a modern Midwestern hub, and how Champaign's rise wasn't just about growth, but survival against all odds. Because behind every shining street and university tower stands a story of rivalry, resilience, and rebirth that most have forgotten.
When the town of West Urbana became Champaign in 1860, it was still young, barely a decade old, but already full of ambition. The trains that rumbled through its station carried more than goods. They carried dreams, risk, and constant motion. Those iron rails were its arteries, and for years, everything that defined early Champaign pulsed through them. But that momentum came with danger, because in a time before paved streets, before electric lights, a railroad town could burn as easily as it could rise. The Civil War had just begun when Champaign took its new name. While no battles were fought here, the war reshaped the Midwest. Farmers sent food and grain to Union troops. Local blacksmiths and carpenters shifted from wagon repair to equipment for the army. Some men from Champaign County marched east, leaving behind families who depended on the town's growing economy to survive. When the war ended in 1865, America changed almost overnight. Railroads expanded west, and Champaign stood ready at the junction. The Illinois Central Line, stretching from Cairo in the south to Chicago in the north, made the town a vital stop for trade and travelers. Hotels rose near the depot. The Doane House became one of the most famous, serving as both a resting place and a symbol of progress. Imagine the scene, travelers stepping off the train into a noisy town square. Horses clattering, vendors shouting, steam from the engines cutting through the prairie air. But progress had its dark side. Fires swept through wooden buildings, floods turned dirt streets into rivers of mud. Saloons crowded the downtown district, and crime followed close behind. Newspaper editors in neighboring Urbana criticized Champaign's reputation, calling it rowdy and unrefined. Yet for every fire that destroyed a block, Champaign built it back in brick. By the 1870s, the city's downtown began to look permanent. Brick businesses replaced wooden ones. The railroad lines were reinforced, and commerce boomed. But the biggest story of the decade was the rise of the Illinois Industrial University, the seed of today's University of Illinois. The school's opening in 1868 was small, just 77 students in a few buildings, but it marked a new identity for the area. Champaign wasn't just a rail stop anymore, it was becoming an intellectual center. Still, the early years were uncertain. The university struggled with low enrollment and internal conflict. Some farmers felt it strayed too far from its agricultural mission. Others criticized its leadership. In those years, Champaign and Urbana both claimed the university as their own, despite its border location. Urbana argued it had secured the bid through political connections. Champaign countered that its rail line kept the school alive. The rivalry deepened, sometimes playfully, sometimes bitterly. But as the 1880s approached, both towns began to realize something. Their fates were linked. The railroad might have built Champaign, but the university would sustain it. Professors, students, and families brought culture, demand for housing, and new ideas. Soon bookstores, supply shops, and cafes appeared. The character of the city began to shift from trade and transport to education and invention. Still, for most residents, life was anything but easy. Champaign was a frontier town, growing faster than its systems could handle. Streets were unpaved, water and sewage infrastructure lagged behind, disease outbreaks struck during the humid summers. And beneath the progress, social divides ran deep. The economy depended heavily on agriculture. Grain elevators lined the railroad. Local merchants thrived on the farm trade, but farmers faced unpredictable markets. Drought, locusts, and price crashes made many years uncertain. Champaign's prosperity could vanish with a bad harvest. Then came the Panic of 1873, a nationwide financial collapse. Businesses closed, railroads cut jobs, construction halted. For Champaign, it was the first real test of survival. Many towns in the Midwest didn't recover, but Champaign did. Slowly, the trains kept running and merchants reopened. The community organized relief efforts. The university, though struggling, kept its doors open, offering stability in chaos. And as the century neared its end, something extraordinary happened. Champaign began to modernize. The 1880s brought electric lights to downtown. Telephone lines appeared. The first waterworks were built. Streetcars connected neighborhoods, linking Champaign and Urbana closer than ever before. What had begun as two rival towns were now twin centers of one growing region. Yet despite progress, the city's image remained complicated. Locals proudly called it ambitious, outsiders whispered it was wild. Crime and political corruption occasionally marred its reputation. Saloons outnumbered churches in parts of downtown, and temperance groups waged public battles to reform the town's image. Amid all the turmoil, something unexpected was brewing.
A quiet cultural identity began to take root. The university wasn't just training farmers anymore. It was producing engineers, architects, and scientists. Music and arts programs flourished. The town's small theaters hosted performances that drew audiences from miles around. Champaign was growing up. By 1890, it had become one of central Illinois' most important cities, a mix of grit, intellect, and restless energy. Its population surged, new schools were built, and civic pride soared. Yet the city's leadership knew it stood at a crossroads. It had to evolve beyond a rail hub if it wanted to survive the new century. When the 20th century began, Champaign stood at a fragile crossroads between promise and uncertainty. It was a city young enough to dream, but old enough to know how quickly dreams could vanish. The rails that once defined it were still vital, but the world was changing fast, and for the first time, the future wasn't written in iron and steam. The city had grown out of prairie dust into a place of purpose. Its streets buzzed with the energy of new technology. Streetcars rattled down Neal Street. Gas lamps gave way to electricity. Automobiles sputtered along the muddy roads, confusing horses and thrilling onlookers. The population was climbing past 10,000, and the people of Champaign believed they were living in a new age. But progress never comes quietly. The early 1900s brought waves of newcomers to central Illinois, farmers, tradesmen, and students chasing opportunity. Immigrants arrived from Europe. African-American families began moving north from the Deep South during the Great Migration, seeking work and safety. Champaign became a meeting point of cultures, and with that came tension. Segregation, both open and unspoken, took root in parts of the city. Black residents were often confined to the north side of Champaign, where schools and public services lagged behind. Yet that same community built strength in unity. Churches became gathering places. Entrepreneurs opened barbershops, cafes, and social halls that served as cultural centers long before civil rights was a national phrase. The University of Illinois, meanwhile, was transforming faster than anyone expected. By the 1910s, it was no longer a modest agricultural school. It had become a nationally recognized institution. Engineers trained here built bridges, railways, and aircraft. The architecture program attracted visionary designers. And in 1916, the first Fighting Illinois football team marched onto the field, giving the campus and community something new to rally behind. Still, not all was celebration. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, and Champaign felt the weight immediately. The university became a training site for soldiers. Local young men enlisted, and women took up roles in nursing and education to support the war effort. For a brief moment, patriotism united the divided city. The war brought tragedy, but also progress, pushing new technologies and education programs that would shape the post-war years. Then came the Roaring '20s, and Champaign roared along. Jazz clubs, movie theaters, and speakeasies appeared across downtown. The Illinois Theater drew packed audiences. Young people flooded the streets on Saturday nights, celebrating modernity in a town once defined by horse-drawn wagons. The city felt alive, optimistic, unstoppable. But beneath that glow, cracks were forming. The same economic boom that fueled nightlife also fed speculation. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Champaign fell hard. Businesses shuttered. Unemployment soared. Local banks struggled. University enrollment dropped, and construction froze. Yet in that despair, Champaign revealed its most enduring quality: resilience. Community programs emerged. Churches and civic groups organized food drives. Students helped farm families survive. The university experimented with local agriculture initiatives to combat poverty, teaching efficiency and sustainability. In the face of national collapse, the people of Champaign didn't surrender. They adapted. And then, just as the economy began to recover, the world was thrown into chaos once more. When World War II erupted in 1939, Champaign once again became a hub of mobilization. The university's engineering departments pivoted toward wartime research, helping to develop technology for the armed forces. Local factories were converted for production. Train stations saw soldiers departing daily. For many residents, this was a time of pride mixed with fear. Young men left for Europe and the Pacific. Families rationed food and gas. Black residents, long excluded from parts of the workforce, found new opportunities in wartime industries, but also new struggles when peace returned. In 1945, when the war ended, Champaign celebrated with parades and church bells. But underneath the victory, there was a quiet realization. The world had changed again, and so had the city. The returning veterans brought ambition, education, and the desire for something better. The GI Bill flooded the university with students. Champaign's neighborhoods expanded rapidly. Streets stretched outward to meet the growing demand for housing. New schools, churches, and businesses appeared overnight. It was the start of a new era, a post-war rebirth that would reshape the city's identity once more. But with that boom came a new kind of pressure. Growth meant opportunity, but also inequality. Expansion brought prosperity to some and left others behind. Racial tensions simmered. Infrastructure strained under population surges. The unity of wartime faded into the complexity of modern life. Still, through every challenge, Champaign's dual identity persisted. One part railroad grit, one part university intellect. It was a city built on contradiction and strength. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Champaign stood on the edge of something extraordinary. The war had ended, but its echoes filled the city's streets. Soldiers returned home carrying both memories and ambitions. Across the prairie, a new generation was ready to build, study, and dream. For Champaign, that meant change, faster and deeper than ever before. The University of Illinois exploded in size. Fueled by the GI Bill, thousands of veterans flooded campus. Dormitories overflowed. Temporary housing was built in old army barracks, and neighborhoods stretched outward to accommodate the surge. Between 1945 and 1955, the university's enrollment nearly tripled. This wasn't just an academic institution anymore. It was the economic heart of the region. The city mirrored that growth. Subdivisions appeared across former farmland. Neal Street and Green Street turned into busy commercial arteries. Cafes, bookstores, and diners became social hubs for a generation of young people who had survived war and were determined to enjoy peace. But beneath the optimism, a quiet question stirred. Could Champaign keep up with its own success? The influx of people strained infrastructure. Roads cracked under new traffic. Schools struggled to handle swelling populations. The city's services, water, power, and sanitation needed massive upgrades. Yet the energy of post-war America made anything feel possible. Then, in the 1950s, Champaign took its next leap forward, into the technological age. The University of Illinois emerged as a leader in engineering and computer science. In 1952, a small team on campus began developing a machine unlike anything seen before. They called it the ILLAC, one of the world's first automatic electronic digital computers. It marked the birth of computing innovation in the Midwest, long before Silicon Valley defined the tech frontier.
Few realized it then, but this was the beginning of a quiet revolution. Through the 1950s and 60s, Champaign and Urbana became known not just for education, but for invention. The university's research programs attracted brilliant minds from across the country and around the world. The city began to blend small-town character with global intellect. Professors lived next to farmers. Immigrant families opened restaurants near campus. And for the first time, the culture of the city reflected a truly international spirit. But that progress wasn't free of conflict. While innovation thrived inside laboratories, the streets outside told a different story. Racial segregation still scarred parts of the city. Many African-American families, concentrated in the north side, faced housing discrimination and limited access to public resources.
Employment opportunities were unequal. Civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s found their voice here, too, students and local activists marching together, demanding fair housing and equal treatment. Those years were turbulent. The Vietnam War sparked protests across the university. Police clashes, political division, and the struggle for civil rights made Champaign a mirror of America itself, caught between progress and unrest. Still, through the tension, the city evolved. In 1969, the university's computer scientists achieved something historic. They created Plato, one of the world's first networked computer systems. What began as a teaching tool became a platform that introduced early forms of email, online chat, and digital learning. Decades before the internet became public, its early pulse could already be felt here in the labs of Champaign-Urbana. It was proof that this prairie town had become a quiet engine of the future. But for many lifelong residents, the pace of change felt dizzying. The once sleepy downtown was losing ground to new suburban shopping centers. Old neighborhoods were being demolished for development. Some worried that the city was losing its identity to the constant churn of students and modernization. Then came the 1970s, a decade of both reflection and growth. The university continued to expand, now recognized among the top public institutions in the country. Research grants poured in. Technology firms began to take interest in the region. Yet everyday life still carried the rhythm of a Midwestern city. Farmers markets opened on weekends, high school football games packed the stands, and downtown Champaign, after years of decline, began to stir with new life as local leaders pushed to restore its historic buildings and attract small businesses. There was pride again in the city's story, in the way it had balanced education, innovation, and community. By 1980, Champaign was no longer just a railroad town, no longer just a university outpost. It was a living example of what small American cities could become, a place where industry and intellect met, where local heritage coexisted with global ambition.